They refused to enter the abandoned church until the snow buried every road. In the winter of 1884, the town of Bell's Crossing sat at the edge of the northern plains, where the wind had no mercy and the snow came down like judgment. It was not a large town. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? And if you enjoy forgotten frontier stories, harsh winters, and survival tales from the old American West, make sure to subscribe to Frontier Shelter. There was one general store, one blacksmith shop, one small schoolhouse, one sheriff's office, and a crooked row of cabins built by people who had learned to live with hard ground, empty skies, and long silences. Most travelers passed through Bell's Crossing and kept moving west.
The ones who stayed were either too stubborn to leave, too poor to begin again, or too wounded by life to believe another place would treat them better. Above the town, on a low hill beyond the last line of cabins, stood an old church. At least it had once looked like a church. By 1884, the white paint had peeled away in long strips. The front steps sagged under years of rain, dust, and frost. One window had been boarded from the inside. Another was cracked from corner to corner like a spiderweb frozen in glass. The small bell tower leaned slightly east, as if the whole building had grown tired of standing against the wind. Nobody in Bell's Crossing used the church anymore. The doors had been shut for almost 7 years. Some people said the place was cursed. Some said the foundation was weak. Some said they had heard singing from inside after midnight, though no living soul admitted to stepping through the doorway. Children dared each other to run up the hill and touch the rusted handle. Grown men laughed when they spoke of it in daylight, then lowered their voices when the sun went down. The truth was not as dramatic as the rumors. 7 years earlier, during a Christmas service, a terrible storm had rolled across the plains. Snow gathered on the roof until the old beams groaned like injured animals. Near the end of the final hymn, one of the rear supports cracked. A part of the ceiling dropped over the last 2 pews. No one died, but 3 people were hurt badly, and the minister's wife never walked without pain again. After that night, the church was closed. A new meeting room was built beside the schoolhouse. The preacher left the following spring. The town learned to pray elsewhere, gather elsewhere, and remember elsewhere. The old church was left to the mice, the dust, the wind, and the stories people invented when they wanted to explain why a place made them afraid. But one woman in town never stopped caring for it. Her name was Martha Whitcomb. She was 61 years old, though the cold and grief made her look older. Her face was thin, her hands were rough, and her gray hair was always pinned beneath a faded black bonnet. She lived alone in a narrow cabin at the foot of the hill, close enough to see the church from her kitchen window. Her husband, Elias, had helped lay the stone foundation when the church was new. Her 2 sons had been baptized beneath its roof. Her youngest daughter had been married there on a bright June morning, with wildflowers tied to every pew. All of them were gone now. Fever had taken one child, war had taken another, the prairie had taken the rest in quiet ways that left no names in newspapers. Every Saturday morning, Martha climbed the hill with a broom, a lantern, and a little iron key hanging on a string around her neck. She swept the floor. She cleared snow from the steps when her back allowed it. She checked the stovepipe. She patched cracks in the walls with clay and old cloth. She stacked firewood in the side room, one careful bundle at a time. She stored jars of beans, sacks of flour, candles, blankets, dried apples, and a small barrel of water near the back wall. The town laughed at her for it. Martha heard them. She heard them at the general store when she came to buy salt and coffee. She heard them outside the blacksmith shop when men leaned against the fence and talked as if old women could not understand insult unless it was shouted. She heard children repeat the words their parents used at supper tables. Old Martha is preparing a house for ghosts. Old Martha thinks the church is still holy. Old Martha keeps blankets for dead people. She never answered them. If someone asked her why she wasted her strength on a building no one trusted, she gave the same answer every time. A shelter does not stop being a shelter because people forget it. Most people shook their heads and walked away. There was one person in Bell's Crossing who did not laugh. Clara Reed, the school teacher, often watched Martha from the schoolhouse window. Clara was 26, new to the frontier, and still soft enough to believe that people should not mock what they did not understand. She had come from St. Louis with a trunk full of books, a good coat, and a heart full of brave ideas. Bell's Crossing had spent 2 winters teaching her that kindness could be rarer than sugar, and that cold weather could turn ordinary fear into cruelty. One afternoon in early December, Clara found Martha outside the old church, trying to lift a warped shutter back into place. "Let me help you," Clara called. Martha turned, surprised. "You should not be up here, Miss Reed. Folks will say you have lost your good sense. They already say that because I teach geography to children who would rather throw chalk." Martha smiled at that. Together they pushed the shutter into position and tied it with wire. The wind scraped at the boards while they worked. It smelled of iron, smoke, and coming snow. When they stepped inside, Clara expected the church to feel dead. It did not. It was cold, yes, and dim, and old dust lay in the corners. But the pews were still standing. The little stove near the front was rusted, but not ruined. The roof had been braced in 2 places with new timber. The floorboards creaked, but they held beneath her feet. Clara looked around at the blankets, the stacked wood, the lanterns, the jars, and the covered barrel of water. "You keep supplies here?" "I keep what I can," Martha said. "For yourself?" Martha ran her hand across the back of a pew, "For whoever needs them." Clara was quiet for a moment. There was something holy in that answer, though it had nothing to do with sermons. A week later, the first warning came. It did not come from a newspaper. It did not come from the telegraph line, which had been unreliable since November. It did not come from any official man in a good coat with a serious voice. It came from the animals. The horses refused to settle in their stalls. The milk cows pressed close to the barn walls. Birds vanished from fence posts and bare branches. Dogs tucked themselves beneath porches and would not come when called. Even the old mule behind the general store, a beast known for sleeping through thunder, stood with his ears forward, staring north. The sky changed before noon. It turned pale and strange, not gray exactly, but dull and bruised, as if the light itself had been stretched thin. The air became so still that smoke from chimneys rose straight upward and seemed to freeze there. Martha saw it from her kitchen window. She put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and walked straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniel Pike was a broad man with tired eyes and a mustache that had gone white at the edges. He was not cruel, but he trusted what he could see, touch, and measure. He did not like warnings that came from clouds, animals, or old women with grief in their voices. "There's a bad storm coming," Martha told him. He leaned back in his chair. "It is December, Martha. Bad storms are not exactly strangers. This one is different. You know that by looking at birds and horses, and the pressure in my bones and that line of cloud in the north." The sheriff glanced through the window. "Looks like weather to me. It will be more than weather," he sighed. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell people to prepare. Bring extra wood inside. Keep children close, and if the wind turns white, send them up to the church." At that, the sheriff's expression changed. "The church? It is on high ground. It has a stove. It has supplies. It also has bad memories. Memories do not freeze people. Pride does." The sheriff rubbed his forehead. "Nobody will go in there." "Then make them." "Martha, I cannot order a town into an abandoned church because your knees ache and the birds flew away." Martha looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said softly. "I suppose you cannot." She left without another word. By sunset, the temperature had fallen so quickly that water froze in buckets near back doors. The wind arrived before the snow, sliding between buildings in thin, cutting streams. Then the first flakes began to fall, light at first, almost gentle. Children pressed their faces to windows and smiled. Mothers pulled curtains shut. Men brought in extra logs and told one another they had seen worse. By midnight, the storm had found its full voice. Snow struck the town sideways. Wind hammered doors and rattled shutters. Roof beams complained beneath the weight gathering above them. Horses kicked at barn walls. Lamps flickered in cabins where families sat close to stoves and listened to the world disappear beyond their windows. By dawn, there was no road left, only white. The trail east was gone. The trail west was gone. The path to the river vanished under drifts taller than fence rails. Wagons on Main Street became white humps in the storm. The schoolhouse door could not be opened from inside until the older boys pushed against it with their shoulders. Still, Bell's Crossing refused to be frightened. Not openly. People were used to storms. They told themselves this one would pass by afternoon. They told children to sit near the fire. They boiled coffee. They checked windows. They complained about the cold in voices that tried to sound ordinary. Then the first roof failed. It happened at the old feed shed behind Miller's stable. Snow had gathered too deep on the back slope, and when the wind shifted, the whole structure gave a cracking scream and folded inward. 2 horses were trapped beneath the beams. Men rushed to help, tying ropes around their waists so they would not vanish in the white air before reaching the stable. They saved 1 horse. They could not save the other. That was when the town became quiet in a different way. At noon, Clara Reed stood inside the schoolhouse with 17 children and listened to the wind strike the walls like ocean waves. She had dismissed class early the day before, but several children had returned that morning because their parents thought the schoolhouse safer than thin cabins at the edge of town. Now the road home was gone, and the youngest ones were crying. The stove was burning low. The woodpile behind the schoolhouse was buried. Clara looked through the frosted window toward the hill. She could barely see the church through the snow, but she knew it was there, and she knew Martha had prepared it. She wrapped her shawl tight and told the oldest boy, Samuel, to keep the stove fed with the last of the wood. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To find help. You cannot go outside. I will not be long." But the moment Clara opened the door, the wind tore into the room with such force that 3 children screamed. Snow blew across the floor. Clara pushed her way outside and nearly fell before she reached the steps. The world had become sound, cold, and whiteness. She could not see the general store from the schoolhouse porch. She tied a rope around the railing and moved by memory. At the sheriff's office, she found Daniel Pike with 2 men, all of them wrapped in coats and scarves, arguing over whether to try for the eastern road. "You cannot leave the children in the schoolhouse," Clara shouted over the wind. The sheriff turned. "Miss Reed, get back inside. The stove is nearly out. The wood is buried. Some of them are too small to last another night in that building." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "We will move them to the meeting room. The meeting room roof is lower than the schoolhouse roof. If it fills with smoke or snow, we will have no second chance." One of the men behind him said, "What do you suggest? The ghost church?" Clara looked at him. "Yes." The room went still. "The sheriff said, Clara." She stepped closer. "Martha has wood there, blankets, food, water. I saw it myself." The man laughed bitterly. "You went inside that place?" "Yes," Clara said, "and I am glad I did." The sheriff looked toward the window, though nothing could be seen beyond it. "No one will agree to go. Then they can refuse in a warm building instead of dying in a cold one." Before he could answer, the door burst open. A young man stumbled inside, covered in snow from hat to boots. It was Thomas Avery, whose family lived near the western edge of town. "The Weaver cabin is gone," he gasped. The sheriff grabbed his arm. "Gone how?" "Roof caved in. Chimney broke through. Mrs. Weaver is hurt. There are children inside." The sheriff was already reaching for his coat. Within 10 minutes, a rescue party left the office, tied together with rope. Clara went with them, despite the sheriff ordering her not to. They moved through the storm bent low, following fence lines where they could, counting steps where they could not. The Weaver cabin was half buried. The roof had collapsed over the rear room, and smoke leaked from the broken chimney in dark, desperate puffs. Inside, Mrs. Weaver lay with a bleeding cut above her brow, clutching a baby beneath her coat. 2 children huddled under a table. Mr. Weaver was trying to lift a beam with hands already blue from cold. They pulled them out one by one. "Where do we take them?" Thomas shouted. The sheriff looked toward the center of town. His face was hard with the truth he had resisted. The meeting room was too far against the wind. The schoolhouse was already failing. The church sat uphill, above the worst drifts, with its back wall against a rise of stone that broke the northern wind. To the church, Clara said, "Mr. Weaver looked at her as if she had asked him to step into a grave. "Not there. Your roof is gone," Clara said. "Your wife is bleeding. Your baby is freezing. Walk." Something in her voice allowed no argument. They climbed. The hill was brutal. Snow struck their faces like sand. Twice the baby stopped crying, and each time Mrs. Weaver shook her gently until a weak sound came out. The sheriff carried one child under his arm. Clara held the other by the hand and dragged him when his legs failed. At the top of the hill, the old church emerged from the storm. It did not look cursed. It looked waiting. Martha was already there. She had seen the men moving through town from her cabin window. She had climbed the hill alone before they arrived, unlocked the door, lit 2 lanterns, and begun coaxing flame into the stove. When the rescue party stumbled inside, warmth had not yet filled the room, but fire was alive. Martha did not ask questions. She took the baby. She wrapped Mrs. Weaver's head. She gave the children blankets and told Clara where to find dry socks in a wooden box beneath the front pew. The sheriff stood near the door, breathing hard, snow melting from his hat brim. For a moment, he looked at Martha as though seeing her for the first time. "You really kept all this here," he said. Martha placed another log in the stove. "I told you I did." Outside, the storm grew worse. By late afternoon, the town began to understand that the church was no longer a memory. It was a refuge. The Miller family came next after the wall of their stable split and let wind into their house. Then came old Mr. Cargill, half frozen and furious, refusing help even while 2 boys carried him between them. Then came Mrs. Bell with 3 grandchildren, one of them missing a boot. Then came the blacksmith, who had once joked that Martha was preparing a wedding for the wind. Now he arrived carrying a sack of potatoes and would not meet her eyes. Each time the door opened, the storm entered with the people. Each time Martha closed it again. By nightfall, 37 people crowded the old church. The stove glowed red. Blankets were stretched across pews. Children slept in small bundles near the front. Men took turns clearing snow from the outside of the door so it would not seal them in. Women melted snow in pots and passed warm water to the sick and shaking. For the first time in 7 years, voices filled the abandoned church. Not hymns, not sermons, human voices, whispered prayers, quiet apologies, children asking for mothers, mothers lying that everything would be all right, men arguing over the safest way to bring more firewood, Martha moving among them with a lantern in one hand and calm in every step. Near midnight, the bell rang. Everyone froze. It was not a full ring, only a cracked, uneven sound from above, like metal striking metal in the wind. A child began to cry. The blacksmith looked toward the ceiling. "I knew it. This place is haunted." Martha turned on him so sharply that even the sheriff looked startled. "No, Mr. Harlan, it is not haunted. The bell rope is loose, and the wind has found it. That is all. Fear does not become truth just because it is loud." No one spoke after that. The sheriff climbed carefully into the bell tower with Samuel, the oldest schoolboy, and tied the rope down. When they came back, their faces were pale from the cold, but the bell was silent. The storm was not. By the second morning, Bell's Crossing had disappeared. Snow covered windows to their middle frames. Drifts swallowed wagons. Fences vanished. The path between buildings had to be dug by hand, and every trip outside became a risk. The cold entered lungs like broken glass inside the church. People began to change. The first change was silence. Not the frightened silence of the night before, but a listening silence. People watched Martha. They noticed the way she knew exactly where everything was, the way she had counted blankets and jars, the way she measured flour without wasting a pinch, the way she told children stories when they became restless, then checked on the wounded without expecting thanks. Clara helped her as much as she could. The sheriff did too. At noon, a terrible discovery came. The side room had less firewood than Martha expected. When the blacksmith and Thomas Avery searched the stack, they found that some of the lower logs were damp from a leak in the wall. They would burn badly, if at all. The stove had enough dry wood for 1 more night, perhaps 2 if they were careful. Beyond that, they would need more. There was wood in town, of course, behind houses, beside stables, under collapsed porches. but getting it meant crossing blind white space in winds strong enough to knock a man down. No one volunteered at first. Then Martha spoke. "There is cut wood behind my cabin." The sheriff shook his head. "Too far. Not if you follow the fence from the cemetery gate." "Martha, you are not going." "I did not say I was." She looked around the room. Some of the men lowered their eyes. It was the blacksmith who finally stood. "I will go." Martha looked at him. He cleared his throat. "I know I have said things I should not have said. This is not the moment for confession," Martha said. "It is the moment for rope." A few people almost smiled. The sheriff, the blacksmith, Thomas Avery, and 2 other men tied themselves together and left through the front door with sacks and axes. Clara stood with the children and listened to the rope scrape across the threshold as it vanished into the storm. They were gone for nearly an hour. When they returned, one man had frost on his eyelashes so thick he could barely see. The blacksmith's hands were bleeding through his gloves, but they brought back wood, not enough for a week, but enough for hope. Martha took the first bundle from the blacksmith. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan." He looked ashamed. "No, ma'am, thank you." That evening the storm shifted. Instead of coming from the north, it struck from the west, directly against the front of the church. The old doors shook in their frame. Snow forced itself through cracks. The stovepipe rattled. A groan moved through the roof beams, and every adult in the room looked upward. The memory of the old accident returned at once. Someone whispered, "It is happening again." Another person said, "We should leave." "Leave to where?" Clara asked. No one answered. A deep crack sounded above the rear pews. People screamed. The sheriff shouted for everyone to move toward the front, away from the back wall. Children were lifted. Blankets were dragged. A jar shattered under someone's boot. The old fear, buried for 7 years, rose in the room like smoke. Martha walked straight down the center aisle. "Martha," Clara called. "Come back." But Martha kept moving until she stood beneath the rear beam. She lifted the lantern and studied it. The beam had not broken. A branch, torn loose by wind, had struck the roof outside and scraped along the shingles. The sound had been terrible, but the church still held. Martha turned to face the room. "Listen to me," she said. No one did. So she struck the lantern handle against the side of a pew. The sharp sound cut through the panic. "Listen to me. The church held that night, and it will hold this one. Elias Whitcomb braced these beams with oak after the accident. I watched him do it. I helped carry the timber. I know every board in this place better than some of you know your own floors." Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "You were told this building failed because it was cursed. That is not true. It failed because men ignored the weight on the roof. Then, when people were frightened, they blamed the walls instead of their own neglect. The room went still." Martha looked at the sheriff. "We do not survive by being unafraid. We survive by doing what must be done while afraid." The sheriff slowly nodded. "Then tell us what must be done. Clear the back slope of the roof if the wind drops. Brace the front doors with pews. Keep children away from the windows. Feed the stove small and steady. No more panic." And so they obeyed her. It was a strange thing, the way authority can move from one person to another in a single hour. Before the storm, Martha had been the old widow with the ghost church. Now men waited for her instructions. Mothers asked her where to place the children. The sheriff did not command without looking at her first. By the 3rd day, hunger sharpened tempers. The beans were cooked thin. The flour was stretched into flat cakes on the stove. The dried apples were saved for the children. Coffee ran out, which caused nearly as much despair as the snow itself. People began to speak of the past. Not because they wanted to, but because being trapped together leaves little room for pretending. Mrs. Bell admitted she had told her grandchildren never to go near Martha's cabin because sorrow was catching. Mr. Cargill confessed that he had voted against repairing the church years earlier because he did not want town money spent on a building that reminded people of failure. The blacksmith said nothing for a long time. Then, near evening, he stood and walked to where Martha was mending a torn blanket. "I said cruel things," he told her. "Yes," Martha said without looking up. "I thought they were harmless. Most cruel people do." He swallowed. "My boy is warm because of your blankets." Martha's hands paused. Then she said, "See that he stays that way." It was not forgiveness, not exactly, but it was not rejection either. That night, Clara found Martha sitting alone near the back wall, her face lit by the low lantern. "You should rest," Clara said. "So should you. I am younger. That is not always an advantage." Clara sat beside her. "Were you angry with them all these years?" Martha looked toward the sleeping families some days. "And now I am tired." Clara waited. Martha drew a slow breath. "When Elias died, people came to my cabin with bread, broth, kind words. Then weeks passed, then months. Grief makes people uncomfortable when it does not leave quickly enough. They stopped coming. I do not blame them for that. Life is heavy. Everyone carries something." She looked toward the stove, but the church was full of my dead. My husband, my children, my girl in her wedding dress. Every memory I had left was sitting in these pews. When people mocked this place, I felt as if they were mocking them too. Clara's eyes stung. Why did you keep preparing it for those same people? Martha was quiet for a long time. Because Elias would have, outside, the wind screamed across the hill. Inside, Clara reached for Martha's hand. On the fourth morning, the storm finally began to weaken, not stop. Only weaken. The white wall beyond the windows softened into shapes. The general store roof appeared below the hill like a dark line under snow. Chimneys showed themselves. Fence posts emerged. The town was still buried, but the world had edges again. The sheriff chose 6 people to make the first descent. They found damage everywhere. 3 cabins had collapsed. 2 barns were ruined. The meeting room roof had split down the center. The schoolhouse was half filled with snow after a window gave way. Had the children remained there, they would not have lived through the second night. When the rescue party returned with the news, nobody spoke for several minutes. Clara looked at the sleeping children near the stove. The sheriff removed his hat. The blacksmith sat down heavily and covered his face with both hands. Martha closed her eyes. She did not look victorious. People who are proved right by tragedy rarely do. By afternoon, the storm died into a soft falling snow. The door of the church opened, and cold sunlight poured across the floor. One by one, the people of Bell's Crossing stepped outside. They stood on the hill and looked down at what remained of their town. Roofs were broken. Roads were gone. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys. The plains stretched white in every direction, beautiful and merciless. Behind them, the old church stood with snow piled against its walls and frost shining on its cracked windows. No one called it cursed. No one called it haunted. No one laughed. The next days were hard. Survival did not end when the storm stopped. It changed shape. Paths had to be dug. Animals had to be found. Broken roofs had to be covered with canvas and boards. Food had to be shared. The dead horse had to be dragged from the stable. The Weaver cabin had to be abandoned until spring. The church remained open. Families slept there while repairs were made. The stove burned every night. Clara taught lessons in the front pews because the schoolhouse was unusable. The sheriff held town meetings beside the cracked window. The blacksmith repaired hinges, latches, and stove parts without asking payment. Mrs. Bell washed blankets and hung them across the pews to dry. Martha moved through it all quietly. She did not say, "I told you." She did not need to. A week after the storm, Sheriff Pike climbed the hill alone and found Martha sweeping the church floor. For a while, he stood by the door and watched her. Then he removed his hat. "Martha, Sheriff, I was wrong." She kept sweeping. "I should have listened." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "I almost got people killed." Martha stopped then and looked at him. "Almost is a word God gives us so we can change before it becomes too late." The sheriff's face tightened. "The town wants to repair the church proper. New roof, new stove, windows, steps." Martha looked down at the broom in her hands. "Do they?" "They do." "And what do they want to call it?" The sheriff seemed confused. "Call it? People name things when they are ashamed of forgetting them." He thought for a moment. "Martha's shelter, maybe." She gave a small, tired laugh. No, it was a church before it was mine. It was a shelter before it was anyone's. Call it what it is." The sheriff looked around the room. Bell's Crossing Shelter House. Martha considered that. Then she nodded. "That will do." In the spring, when the snow melted and the roads returned, travelers began stopping at Bell's Crossing again. They saw men repairing the old church roof. They saw women carrying fresh curtains up the hill. They saw children painting the front steps while Martha scolded them for splashing whitewash on their boots. By summer, the building looked almost alive. The bell tower was straightened. The stove was replaced. The cracked window was repaired, though Clara asked that one thin line in the old glass be preserved as a reminder. Shelves were built along the back wall for emergency supplies. Blankets were folded neatly in cedar boxes. Barrels of water were sealed and dated. A map of winter routes was pinned beside the door. Every household in Bell's Crossing contributed something. A sack of flour, a candle mold, a cord of wood, a quilt, a shovel, a lantern. Even those who had little gave a little because they knew now what little could become when gathered before disaster, not after. On the first Sunday of October, the town held a meeting in the restored building. It was not exactly a church service, though some prayed. It was not exactly a celebration, though children laughed. It was something quieter than both. Sheriff Pike stood at the front and spoke about the storm. He did not make himself heroic. He told the truth, which was harder. He said they had been proud. He said they had been foolish. He said they had mistaken fear for wisdom and memory for danger. Then he asked Martha to speak. She refused at first. The town waited. Clara touched her arm. Martha finally rose from the second pew and walked to the front. She stood where ministers had once stood, beneath the repaired roof her husband had helped brace years before. For a moment she said nothing. Then she looked at the faces before her, the same faces that had laughed in the store, whispered in the street, and climbed the hill half frozen when there was nowhere else to go. A building is only wood and stone, she said. It does not care whether you love it or fear it. But what you keep inside a building matters. She looked toward the shelves at the back. Firewood matters, food matters, blankets matter, a dry match matters, but more than all of that, memory matters. Not the kind that traps you in yesterday. The kind that teaches you what yesterday cost. No one moved. We left this place empty because we remembered pain. I kept it ready because I remembered love. Both memories were true, but only one of them saved us. Her voice softened. Next winter will come whether we respect it or not. The wind will not ask if we have forgiven one another. Snow will not care who was right. So let this place stand for the simple truth we learned the hard way. She paused. No shelter is useless when someone keeps it ready. And no person is useless because others have forgotten their worth. The room remained silent. Then Clara began to clap. One by one, the others joined. Martha looked embarrassed by the sound, and for the first time in many months she smiled. Years passed, and the story of the great storm changed with every telling. Children who had been carried into the church grew into adults who claimed they remembered every detail, though some had slept through most of it. Men who had been too afraid to enter the building later insisted they had always trusted it. Travelers heard different versions at the general store. Some were plain, some were dramatic. One claimed Martha had rung the bell herself in the middle of the storm to guide lost families through the snow. That part was not true. But stories do not always remain obedient to facts. The important part remained. When winter came, the shelter was stocked. When storms gathered, no one laughed at warnings from old women, animals, aching bones, or strange skies. When strangers passed through Bell's Crossing, they were told where to go if the weather turned, up the hill, to the old church, to the place that people had feared until it saved them. Martha lived 6 more winters. Every Saturday, even after others took over the work, she climbed the hill with her broom and her little iron key. Clara often walked beside her. Sometimes the sheriff came too, though he pretended it was only to check the stovepipe. One cold evening, years after the storm, Martha stood at the church door and looked down at Bell's Crossing. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Children pulled sleds along the road. The blacksmith's boy, the one who had slept beneath Martha's blanket during the storm, was now tall enough to carry wood to the shelter himself. Clara stood beside her. "Do you ever wish they had understood sooner?" Clara asked. Martha watched the town for a long time. "Of course," she said. Then she touched the old key at her neck. But sooner is not promised to people. Only now is. The wind moved over the hill, cold and familiar. Behind them, the church stove glowed warmly through the repaired windows. Inside were blankets, food, water, lanterns, tools, and enough firewood to last through a storm. Not because the town expected disaster every day, but because they had finally learned that preparation was not fear, it was care. And sometimes the thing a town rejects is the very thing that keeps it alive when the roads disappear. That winter, snow came again. It fell hard for 2 days, covering fences and softening the edges of the world. But this time, no one waited for roofs to crack. No one argued with the sky. No one mocked the hill. Families carried supplies early. Children helped stack wood. The sheriff checked every house at the edge of town. Clara moved her youngest students to the shelter before dusk. Martha sat near the stove, wrapped in a quilt, watching the room fill with calm faces instead of desperate ones. Outside, the storm covered every road. Inside, no one was afraid to enter.